All right, welcome to Hoops Tonight, presented by FanDuel here at The Volume. Happy Friday, everybody. You've made it to the weekend. Congratulations. We are closing out our power rankings today with number one, the Golden State Warriors. Now, this morning, I also did about 15 minutes or so on their preseason game at 3 a.m. in Japan against the Washington Wizards and went over a bunch of stuff as it pertained to why they shot so poorly. A bunch of their core players shot below 20% from the field in that game. I wasn't worried about it. I gave my reasoning why. Talked a lot about the Jonathan Kuminga and Moses Moody dynamic as far as how they looked on the wing and which one of those guys I think projects to have the best case to fill that playoff role of Otto Porter Jr. And then at the end, I spent a good 5 minutes or so on James Wiseman and just the good stuff that I saw, a couple areas of improvement as well. You can find that further back in our YouTube feed. Also, obviously, we've done power ranking season previews for 16 different teams up to this point. I'm actually kind of glad that this project is over. I've enjoyed it. I'm glad you guys have enjoyed it, but it's been very time consuming and we finally made it to the finish line. Today, we're going to be covering everything about the Warriors, why I have them number one, what they accomplished last year statistically, what changes they've made to the roster this offseason, what their depth chart looks like right now, what they like to do on the offensive end of the floor. I'm going to spend a good amount of time just kind of breaking down what their sets look like so you can have a better understanding of how the Golden State offense works. Talk about some of their offensive metrics from last year, looking at what they do on the defensive end of the floor, how they came back to beat the Boston Celtics with a defensive effort, then what their best case scenario is, their worst case scenario, and their X factors. So every conceivable angle of Warriors basketball we are going to cover in this season preview today. You guys know the drill. Before we get started, subscribe to the Volume's YouTube channel so you don't miss any more of our videos. Follow me on Twitter at _JasonLT so you guys don't miss any show announcements. That's also where I put NBA footage because I'm not allowed to use it on YouTube. I did a 3.5 minute long video this morning that broke down some of my favorite takeaways from that preseason game this morning. You can find that on my Twitter feed. A bunch of those plays I specifically referenced in the full YouTube video that we did earlier this morning. And then last but not least, if for whatever reason you missed one of these videos and you can't get back over to YouTube to finish them, we do have them in podcast form wherever you get your podcasts under Hoops Tonight. So why do I have the Golden State Warriors at number one? I don't necessarily think they're the most talented team in the league. I think that the Clippers and the Celtics both just have just barely a little bit more talent. Golden State is one of the most talented teams in the league, but I do think in terms of two-way players, the Clippers and Celtics have just a little bit more talent, just barely, a little bit of an advantage there. But the Golden State Warriors are the best collection of talent, coaching, a modern basketball approach that works today, attention to detail, experience, and continuity in this league. And that's why I have them at number one. It's all of those things combined. As we learned from the Boston Celtics last year, having the most talented team in the league doesn't translate necessarily to good basketball if you're sloppy, if you're not well coached. And we spent a lot of time on that yesterday. You can find that in the number 2 video. A lot of Warriors talking there as well as we were going over the NBA Finals quite a bit. But I wanted to take a couple of seconds on a few of those concepts. When we're looking at talent, like I said, the Clippers and Celtics might have a tiny bit more, but not much. Steph is the only real superstar on the roster, but Klay, Draymond, Andrew Wiggins, and Jordan Poole are all stars in their roles, meaning their impact on winning mimics that of a star, just in a different type of role than we're used to seeing from most stars. Everyone in their rotation is a good basketball player. What does that mean? It means they're well-rounded. It means they're not specialists. They're not guys that just shoot threes or just play defense. They all do everything. They all can defend multiple positions. They all can pass. They all can dribble. They all can shoot. That well-rounded versatility is what you need to succeed in this particular system. One of my favorite things about Golden State is I think their player development understands the right things to work on. You guys know the things that I preach on this show all the time. And I was actually having a conversation with Sam Esfandiari from Light Years, and I know a lot of you Warriors fans listen to him. Great guy. Got to meet him in person when we were in Vegas for Summer League. But we were talking about the player development in Golden State, and he talked about how the two things that they preach the most are pull-up shooting in terms of development and perimeter contain on the defensive end of the floor, like sliding your feet and containing the ball. What do we preach about all the time on this show? Like, those are two. pull-up shooting is the number one skill to beat most coverages, because most coverages are designed to take away the easy things and at the expense of leaving open the more difficult things, like pull-up jump shooting, for instance. And then on the defensive end of the floor, containing the basketball is the key to make any defensive scheme work. We're going to talk a lot about that today. The point is their player development in Golden State teaches the right things. And so as a result, they've got a team full of really well-rounded basketball players, and that's a huge part of why they're as good as they are. Coaching. Steve Kerr and Eric Spoelstra are the two best coaches in the league, in my opinion. They understand what works best in the modern NBA on both ends of the floor. So many coaches around the league have a very traditional approach. We talked about this a lot with Mike Budenholzer and what Darvin Ham is bringing to the Lakers. We talked about this a lot with the Lakers in general, with the way they're constructing their roster with small guards and big athletic players, as opposed to wings that can defend multiple positions and play a more versatile style. The Golden State Warriors from the top down are targeting the right types of players that succeed in the modern NBA, and then their coach, Steve Kerr, is teaching them to play a modern style. We're going to talk a lot about that today, particularly as it pertains to their 5-out offense, which we'll talk about quite a bit. They're malleable with their defensive and offensive approach. They're willing to make adjustments. There's not a lot of pride there. Like, they like a ball movement, player movement offense, right? Well, in the NBA Finals against Boston's drop coverage, they leaned heavily into high pick and roll, trying to get Steph off the dribble jump shots. Why? Because that's what the Boston defense was giving. That's Steve Kerr not being stubborn and understanding that his job is not to coach the Warriors offense in a vacuum. His job is to coach the Warriors offense against that specific opponent. And like I said, they preach the right things: perimeter contain, player movement versus ball movement. A lot of teams around the league will pass the ball well, but they don't keep their bodies in motion as much as Golden State does. Their attention to detail in every aspect of the game is as good as you'll find around the league, if not the best. When we get to the defense section, wait till I read to you guys the defensive metrics. I've had, 5 or 6 defensive metrics that I've targeted as indicators of coaching, and the Warriors are near the top in literally every single category. So hats off to Steve Kerr. That's a huge part of why I'm so confident in them. Experience. This is the idea of understanding how to win basketball games. We could talk about talent all day long. We could talk about schemes all day long. Advantages, mismatches in a playoff series or whatever, or skill sets. We can talk about that kind of stuff all day long. But basketball games are usually won in those details. And that's not just Steve Kerr. That's Klay, Steph, and Draymond, and all the guys who've been around all these years that have felt the pain of loss enough times and understood what it took to win enough times that they know that those details are what wins games. More often than not, and this will be a theme throughout this entire season as we're covering the league, containing the basketball on the perimeter, like sliding your feet, extra efforts in rotation, rebounding, so like boxing out, crashing the glass, getting to loose balls, transition defense, sprinting back and getting matched up, talking to each other, understanding the flow of the game, like never getting too high, never getting too low, responding well to runs, staying on the gas when you get a lead, and then closing out games when it's a 4-point game with 4 minutes left. You can win a lot of basketball games just by executing, like every possession down the floor, running the right set, getting the right shot, and defending well. Yeah, some shots are going to go in and some shots are going to miss, but if you execute well at the end of games, you're going to win most of the time. The Warriors have a great deal of experience. They understand how to win basketball games, and that's a huge part of why I have them at the top. The Warriors have been there and done that so many times that I just trust them. Everything going into that NBA Finals series against Boston, everything was pointing me towards Boston. From matchups around the floor in terms of the physicality, the perimeter players, I thought Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum would be able to get to their spots pretty easy against that group. And I still picked the Warriors. You know why? All of those things. Because I knew the Celtics were a little bit better, but I knew they weren't as good of a basketball team. Because being a basketball team is all of those things that I just laid out. And then last but not least, continuity. And I spent a great deal of this time on this on Warriors Media Day, so I'm not going to go too much further. Locker room chemistry, those guys are like brothers. They have clear understanding of roles. It's easy to plug new players in, and they have basketball chemistry. They have a good feel of where they're going to be on the floor at any given time. And last but not least, understanding their scheme. Steve Kerr has a complicated scheme. They run more sets than anybody in the league. So if you have the same guys there for that long, they all know the offense. And so to me, they're a clear number one. And I don't think, even though we have a top tier, with Milwaukee and Boston and the Clippers and the Warriors, there's one team that separates themselves in all of those categories, and it's Golden State. That's why I had them at number 1. So last year, they were 53-29. They won the championship. They were 16th in offense and 2nd in defense. Steph, Klay, and Draymond only played in 142 of 246 available games. So they were not dealt a very good hand of cards last year either. All 3 of them were still ramping up in the Denver series. Steph was just coming back from a foot sprain. Draymond Green had been working his way back from a back injury, and then Klay Thompson was just back to playing NBA basketball for a couple of months. So just a really impressive season all around. This offseason, they lost Otto Porter Jr. and Gary Payton II. The interesting thing there is if you look at their on-off numbers from the playoffs, they were dominant with Gary Payton on the floor, and they were actually negative with him off the floor. So he was a plus-minus hero in the playoffs because of what he did defensively and the little ways he found ways to be dangerous on the offensive end of the floor, whether that was knocking down the occasional corner 3 or running pick and roll with Steph and rolling to the basket, cutting to the basket, offensive rebounds, things along those lines. They're going to need to find somebody that can replace that role, him and Otto Porter Jr. They did add Dante DiVincenzo, who I think will help. JaMychal Green, I'm less excited about, but I want to see how things shake out a little bit more. But they're going to need one of Kuminga or Moody to blossom into a reliable playoff player this year to replace Gary Payton II. Looking at the depth chart, at the guard position, Steph Curry and Jordan Poole. On the wing, Klay Thompson, Andrew Wiggins, Jonathan Kuminga, Dante DiVincenzo, Moses Moody, JaMychal Green, and Patrick Baldwin Jr. Not going to talk much about Patrick Baldwin Jr. tonight because I just need to watch a lot more of him before I can have an opinion. You guys know me. I'm not going to really talk about something if I don't know enough. And then bigs, Draymond Green, James Wiseman, and Kevon Looney. So talking about the offensive end of the floor. They ran a couple of non-5-out sets in that preseason game, and I'm thankful I had the preseason game because all these other teams I had to go into old footage to try to do the best I could to figure out what they run on offense. I got actual stuff that they're running from this training camp, which was helpful and informative here. So they ran a horn set where James Wiseman and Draymond bracketed around Steph, and that ended up kind of breaking down, and then Wiseman ended up getting a seal because it ended up in a switch, and Monty Morris was on him. They also ran a random 4-out set where Steph was at the block, and it was their classic screen the screener set, like Steph back screen for Andrew Wiggins. Monty Morris just barely hesitated as he went to help on the Andrew Wiggins screen, and then Steph immediately came off of a second pin down and got not a wide open, but a pretty decent look at 3. But other than those 2 sets, almost everything they ran the entire game was 5-out. That means guys in the 2 corners, guys on the 2 wings, guy at the top of the key. Now, the difference, you guys know I love 5-out basketball, talk about that all the time on the show. But there's a big difference between the way the Warriors run 5-out and the way the rest of the league runs 5-out. First of all, the Warriors run sets out of 5-out. A lot of teams, 5-out is a spacing concept. It's more just, this is how we situate the floor, and we just need somebody to beat somebody off the dribble so that we can start our drive and kick and start to get good stuff out of that. But the Warriors are running sets, and I mean they're running sets almost every time down the floor. They run more sets than anybody in the league, and it's not even close. About 3 out of 4 times when they come up the floor, they're running a set. And even on that 4th time, they're running some kind of action, maybe just a high ball screen or something along those lines. They don't just play pickup basketball. They run organized basketball. I saw a stat earlier. The best metric that I've seen that kind of tracks this kind of thing is number of shot attempts that you take off of screens. The Golden State Warriors took about 11 shots per game off of screens. And the second place team in the league was the Portland Trailblazers with 6. So literally the Warriors run almost twice as many sets per game as the rest of the teams in the league. Other teams you see near the top there are like teams like Miami. They run a lot of sets too. But the Warriors run sets more frequently than any team in the league. Why do they do it 5-out? Because most teams who run sets, they want players around the block like horns or 4 high or 4 low because they want their bigs around a screen. The reason why they run everything on the perimeter is because the Warriors players have gravity. We've talked about this concept before. When Steph and Klay and Jordan Poole are running off of screens, one of the most frequent defensive breakdowns is multiple defenders following them. But those 2 defenders are going away from the basket. That's taking place outside of the 3-point line. So in the same way that 5-out offense is designed to build driving lanes for drive and kick teams like the Clippers and the Celtics, for the Warriors, it's actually meant to open up cutting lanes and slipping lanes and roll lanes. So like a lot of their actions are, dribble handoffs or ball screens, but it's designed for Draymond or Looney or whoever it is to slip those actions when his man offers help as Steph or Klay is coming off that screen. It just has so much open space around the basket for them to slip and roll into and have space to finish around the rim. And then the fundamental concept in 5-out, and this is the same for driving kick teams as well, it's just harder for you to cover ground in rotation. So if I'm in a 4-out, 1-in, and I beat my man off the dribble, or I hit a pick and pop slipper, like a guy slipping to the basket, the help defender is that 1-in, and he's already there. Because the 4-out, 1-in, the inside guy is probably going to be on the opposite block in what we call the dunker spot. So his defender is going to be standing right under the basket, because as far as the NBA is concerned, as far as the rule goes, you can be in the paint if you're arm's length away from your defender, right? If you're like within legal guarding distance of your defender. So I can stand directly under the rim because my guy's in the dunker spot. I'm in legal guarding position. Now I'm turning and I'm helping as guys are driving right into me. But what if instead of him being in the dunker spot, he's in the opposite corner? Now I'm in a bit of a predicament. I have to like step into the lane and then step out of the lane and then step into the lane and then step out of the lane. A lot of really good offensive players will time their drives or time their slips or cuts right as you're lunging out of the lane, which is what opens things up around the basket. Or if you do have to help, you have to abandon your man in the short corner now, and now that short corner is open. Just covering ground in rotation and actually offering help side defense is 10 times harder in a 5-out scheme than it is in a 4-out, 1-in, or a 3-out, 2-in scheme. So that's why the Warriors do it. That's why the rest of the league does it. But the key difference is that the Warriors will do it with the intention of slipping and rolling and cutting rather than necessarily driving to the basket. So they opened up the game with a 5-out double dribble handoff with Jordan Poole coming out of the left corner. Looney and Draymond both went to go set the screen. There was a dribble handoff. Jordan Poole came off of it. He actually ended up getting a wide open 20-footer at the top of the key. He just missed it. They ran this particular action a bunch, the double dribble handoff coming out of the corner. They had a really interesting counter there where if the guy in the corner, so like a lot of teams will see this action coming, right? And so they'll topside. So like if I'm guarding Jordan Poole and I know he's coming off of that double dribble handoff going this way, I might literally just get entirely in his way, so he has to go through my chest. Well, in that case, they just cut out, and when they cut out, what'll happen is the first screener will just turn and he'll come off the screen instead, and they'll run something out of that. So it's like kind of like a read and react system. They've got baked in counters for when you try to jump in front of their plays, which is the way smart offenses run, and it was really impressive to see that this morning from the Warriors. They also like instead of a dribble handoff version of that play, they run a pass version of that play. So like just two guys will go screen for Steph Curry coming out of the corner, and then they'll pass it to him as he's coming off of that screen. They had one of those in the first half where they hit Draymond slipping. So Draymond was the second screener. Steph caught the pass right as he was coming off. Draymond's man, I think it was Kristaps Porzingis in this case, hedged out on Steph. So Steph just threw an easy little drop pass into the pocket, and Draymond went up and made a layup. They ran a lot of double high ball screens, so they'll have Steph bring it up on the left wing. They'll have one guy in the left corner, and then the guy at the top of the key, and then the right wing will be Wiseman and Draymond, or Draymond and Looney, and they'll both come over and set that double screen. Anytime we talk about double pick and roll, as you guys know, one guy will typically roll to the basket, the other will pop to the three-point line because both bigs will typically drop, and usually you get open stuff around the top of the key. They also ran just some basic high pick and roll with Wiseman. Usually Steph coming out of the wing, Wiseman top of the key, they would set it. They'd have Draymond on the right wing or in the right corner away from the ball as far as he could be, and then two shooters in the corner and the wing, and then just run regular pick and roll. They got a lob dunk out of that. Immediately on the next possession after the lob dunk, Draymond was in the right corner, and Kyle Kuzma had to tag the roller, which opened up a wide open three for Draymond. So basic kind of like give and take of help defense when you start to have success in the paint. But they just run a ton of stuff every time down the floor, usually some form of double screen, either a double ball screen, a double dribble handoff, or a double off ball screen. but it's all designed to get that initial advantage of usually a guy slipping to the basket or cutting. And then from there, they just play basketball. Like if Draymond slips down the lane and he doesn't have a layup, he might kick it out to the guy in the corner, and then they play their drive and kick. So they will play drive and kick, but they do it out of sets rather than doing it out of initial advantage creation. And it makes sense because, this is not a huge physically imposing ball handling team. This isn't Kawhi Leonard and Paul George coming at you every possession, so you're not worried about getting bludgeoned by driving. These are smaller, skinnier players that operate off a screen. So it makes sense that a team like the Clippers would beat you with dribble penetration, and then a team like the Warriors would beat you with sets. But then once that initial advantage is created and they get into rotation, then it's just drive and kick basketball, and everyone's kind of doing the same thing at that point. Looking at isolation, they were the 24th most frequent isolation team in the league, but the 8th most effective. This is just about being picky about when you isolate. Steph averaged 1.2 points per possession in isolation, which is literally outstanding, but he only ran 117 of those possessions all season. That's because he's picky. He usually will only do it if he gets a big on a switch. Again, that's just about being smart, understanding what your strengths are, and being picky about things that you don't want to do as often, and then leaning into your strengths. This is a great off-screen team. That's why they lean heavily into that. They had the third most efficient pick-and-roll ball handling trio in the league. This is about pull-up jump shooting, like we talked about earlier. Pull-up jump shooting is the best way to beat most pick-and-roll coverages. Jordan Poole and Steph were both in the 85th percentile league-wide as pick-and-roll ball handlers, which is awesome. They were the 6th most frequent dribble handoff team and 10th most efficient. Klay Thompson was pulling the most weight here. He was at 1.02 points per possession in dribble handoffs, which was the 74th percentile in the league. No NBA team cuts to the basket more than the Warriors do. They register 12 cut possessions per game at 1.3 points per possession. Both awesome. To give you a comparison, the Mavs and the Sixers register about half as many cut possessions per game. So that just kind of gives you some perspective on how frequently they do that. Like I talked about earlier, I already mentioned this stat. They run almost twice as many off-screen possessions as the rest of the league. 11 for them. The Blazers were in second place with 6. Again, this is just one of the many indicators, and you could just tell by watching the Warriors play that this is the case. But this is one of the many indicators that they run more sets than the rest of the league. Most of the teams that I encountered during this series, they would run sets to start quarters. They would run sets out of basically dead ball situations like made free throws or like out of timeouts, things like that. But in the actual flow of the game, the vast majority of these teams are just running the ball up the floor and running a high pick and roll or picking on a matchup and trying to get into their driving kick. The Warriors run sets, live ball, dead ball, whatever, about 75% of the possessions, from what I can tell by watching. That's a stat that kind of shows an example of how that gets quantified. It's just harder to defend player movement than stagnation. That's just a basic concept in basketball. If you bring up the ball and you just get to your spacing and one guy starts to work off the dribble, the other 4 guys are standing. And if I'm guarding a Warriors team where on every possession there's 3 or 4 interchanges and an action being run, it's just more fatiguing physically to try to guard a team like that. And I think that's one of their biggest playoff advantages. The Warriors almost always go up 2-0 in a playoff series. It's uncommon for them to drop one of their first 2 playoff games. And a huge part of that is their offensive system is so different from the rest of the league that teams get caught off guard early in playoff series. It takes a little while to adjust. Speaking of adjustments, Steve Kerr's willingness to adjust is one of the things I appreciate about him. He's not stubborn, even though he has a strong basketball belief system. Off the dribble shooting versus Boston is the best indicator of this. So during the regular season, the Warriors attempted about 22 pull-up jump shots per game. But they were playing against a Boston Celtics team that was very good defensively and that switched a lot of off-ball actions, particularly ones that were guard to guard. So as a result, because they were running drop coverage against ball screens or other things that involved the big man, Steve Kerr leaned heavily into pick and roll. Why? Because he's got Steph Curry, the best off-the-dribble shooter of all time, and off-the-dribble three-point shooting is one of the best ways to beat a drop coverage, especially one like the Celtics where the big man was lagging too far back. Well, they went up from 22 pull-up jump shots per game in the regular season to 28 pull-up jump shots per game in the Celtics series. That's an indicator of how they were willing to adjust their offensive approach to match the actual need of what they needed to beat that Boston defense. Another example of this willingness to adjust was against the Cavs in 2015 when they were trapping the Steph high pick and roll, and they just spammed high pick and roll, hitting Draymond as the slipper, slipping to the basket, and then him hitting Andre Iguodala in the corner. Again, that was not a team that just spammed high pick and roll in the regular season. That was just something they did as an adjustment to beat a specific matchup. No, there's no value in being stubborn. All that matters is winning the basketball game, and I trust Steve Kerr to make those adjustments. Steph. Sometimes things just don't go right in a playoff series, and you need a heroic effort to carry you. And that's Steph in game 4 of the finals. Like, sometimes you're down 2-1, and the physical matchups aren't really going your way, and you're on the road against a really talented team, and you just need some guy to reach down and pull out an all-time great NBA playoff performance, and that's what Steph did in game 4 of the finals. This is why we talk so much about best player in the world. This is why we talk so much about top-tier superstars. In the game of basketball, it just matters more than it does in other sports. As we go back in champions, Steph last year, Giannis the year before that, LeBron the year before that, Kawhi, then Steph and KD, then Steph and KD, then LeBron, then Steph, then Kawhi, then LeBron, then LeBron. You get the point. You need one of those guys, and the Warriors have one of those guys in Steph. And then, like we talked about earlier, the players surrounding Steph are all good basketball players. They all are versatile. They're not specialists. Moving to the defensive end of the floor, their scheme, they switch 1 through 3 or 1 through 4, depending on whether or not they have 1 or 2 bigs on the floor, and then they drop with their bigs. But they don't switch indiscriminately. They're picky about it to try to avoid mismatches. The vast majority of NBA teams try to attack Steph as much as possible. And Steph is a good defensive player. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But it's mainly for fatigue purposes. It's not like, it'll be easy to score on Steph. It's, if we attack Steph all game long, we might be able to wear out his legs and he might miss some jump shots on the other end of the floor. Well, the Warriors will do things like pre-switching. As they make adjustments in series, they will put Steph on matchups where they don't like to use him in ball screens. A great example of this is that Mavericks series. Early in the series, Steph was guarding Reggie Bullock, and they kept doing like quick pick and pops with him, with Luka. And it was just challenging for Steph to guard those actions. So they like switched that and I can't remember exactly who they put him on. It might have been Dorian Finney-Smith. I can't remember, but they put him somewhere else. So I think it was DFS because they put him there because Dorian Finney-Smith is not as good as a pop like movement shooter. And so those little pick and pop actions weren't working as well. Those are just little X's and O's things and adjustments that the Warriors will do to stop teams from targeting Steph. Again, for the purpose of saving him the fatigue that's caused from it. Metrics from last year. This is insane. If you guys remember the things that I talked about that teach me about how good a coach is and how good his attention to detail is. Defensive rebounding, how well they do dribble contain, points in the paint allowed and defending the three-point line, understanding the most valuable shots, transition defense. Those are the things I look at. Well, not only were the Warriors second in defensive rating, they were 6th in defensive rebounding percentage, so they were a great defensive rebounding team. They were 3rd in steals. That's associated to dribble contain. We're going to talk about that in a minute. They were 4th in paint points allowed. They were 6th in transition defense, according to Cleaning the Glass, and they were 14th in three-point defense. So of the 5 key metrics that I track the most associated with coaching, they were top 6 in 4 of them, and they were top half in the other with 14th and three-point defense. And it's just really difficult to do both. If you prioritize the three-point line, you're naturally going to give up more stuff in the paint. So Steve Kerr he understands what works in modern NBA defense. He coaches it really well. The guys are bought in. They, their star Steph. The biggest credit I offer to Steph is that he just tries hard on defense every single night, even though he's only slightly above average. Just that effort goes so long towards setting the tone for the rest of the roster. The last thing I wanted to talk about as it pertains to the Warriors on the defensive end is the value of dribble contain. And so I wanted to start with the 2022 finals here. So early in the series, they go down 2-1. And some Warriors fans like, they're just making all their threes, or, we're helping too much, or whatever it was. Yes, they were making a lot of threes, and yes, the Warriors were helping too much, which was allowing the Celtics to get into their dribble contain. But the main reason why was the Celtics were getting great dribble penetration. And they were getting great dribble penetration because it's Marcus Smart, Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, and Derek White that are getting into the lane a lot, and they're difficult matchups to handle. But what really happened over the course of that series is at the end of the series, mainly Klay Thompson and Andrew Wiggins, but also some Draymond Green and Gary Payton, they just started containing the basketball. Klay Thompson did an amazing job on Jaylen Brown towards the end of that series of sliding his feet, taking that contact in the chest, and turning Jaylen Brown into a pull-up jump shooter. And then Andrew Wiggins, obviously, like I talked about how I think Jason Tatum is the best perimeter defender in basketball. Andrew Wiggins is right there. It's like those two guys and Mikal Bridges and like Ben Simmons that I'd put in that tier. Andrew Wiggins is right there. And the job that he did on Jason Tatum containing that ball handler was so important. Now, this is where the turnovers and the steals come into play, because think of it like this. If I don't have to help because you're containing the basketball, now I get to be in normal guarding position. What's normal guarding position? Depends on who you're guarding. But typically that means I'm far enough away that I can help, but close enough that I can recover if there's a shooter there. Translation, you're in the passing lane, okay? You're kind of like a little bit of distance off of your man, looking at the ball, looking at the man, ready for the pass to come out so you can close out or play the passing lane. Well, what ended up happening a lot with the Celtics is as Klay Thompson and Andrew Wiggins and Gary Payton and Draymond Green contained the basketball, those guys would drive into the lane a little bit, like get to the 16, 17 feet, get cut off, and then panic and look around, and no one's open. And no one's open because they're not helping. And they're not helping because you're containing the basketball. And so then what ends up happening is you panic and you just throw some stupid pass that looks open and it's not. And next thing you know, they're running the other way. And then there's other stuff. There was some sloppy ball handling. Tatum got picked at half court a few times. There was some sloppiness in there. But a lot of those Boston Celtics turnovers were fueled by Klay Thompson, Draymond Green, Gary Payton, and Andrew Wiggins just containing the basketball so that no one else had to help. And when no one else had to help, no one was open. And so when they were throwing those passes, they're throwing them into dangerous passing lanes and they're turning them over. That dynamic swung the series. The Celtics went up 2-1 because they were getting dribble penetration, and then they lost 3 straight because they no longer were getting dribble penetration. And that's a ton of that credit I want to heap on the Warriors perimeter guys for just sitting in a damn stance, sliding your feet, and taking that contact in the chest. It's just good basketball. Again, this is a huge part of player development. I thought it was really interesting, and I talked more in detail about this in the preseason breakdown that I did. But Moses Moody and them putting him on Bradley Beal in that preseason game today, them saying, like, look, man, if you're going to be someone that we can depend on in a playoff series, we need you to be able to contain the basketball. I think they're going to throw him all sorts of difficult matchups early in the season just to kind of build that up. And he's going to have to learn a unique way to play defense because he's not as fast. He's going to have to give more ground and make up with his length as more of like a positional defender, as we always talk about. But I'm really curious to see how Moses Moody handles those matchups over the course of the season. But internally, organizationally, the Warriors are always hammering home that concept of perimeter contain. Everything else in defense works better when you contain. Not only the turnovers like we were talking about, but then you stay out of rotation. So like if I give up a straight line drive, my teammate's got to cover for me. So now I've got to sprint over to some other spot on the floor to get the next guy. And if we stay out of rotation, it's just less running. So if one guy does his job containing the basketball, it makes everyone else's job more physically easy. It's also easier to rebound because in rotation, you get cross matches. When you get cross matches, you have little guys on big guys. And when little guys are on big guys, the big guy usually gets a rebound. So just in general, that dribble contain concept is so important, and the Warriors are great at it. It's a huge part of why they're so successful defensively. So what's the best case scenario for this Warriors team? Don't need to spend too much time on that. They're a more talented version of last year, so they should repeat if the young guys develop. Worst case scenario, obviously injuries are always a problem with these teams. An injury to someone like a Klay or a Draymond or a Steph would be pretty catastrophic, especially if it was Steph. If they fail to replace that Gary Payton II role, that could be an issue when they get to the later rounds, like the conference finals and finals, just when they're playing more talented teams. If that happens, they could potentially lose to one of the top tier teams in like the conference finals. But to me, they're the clear favorite in the league. Biggest X factor. This is the first time I've done 3 guys instead of 1, but I put Wiseman, Moody, Kuminga. They let Otto Porter Jr. and Gary Payton II go because these guys are supposed to fill those roles. For Wiseman in particular, it's a tricky dynamic because they don't really need him in the rotation when they're healthy. Looney and Draymond proved last year that they were enough. But it's obviously a little bit extra depth there. But because he's that third big in a league that's going away from bigs, it makes his role a little bit somewhat inconsistent, a little bit clunky. His ability to shoot the three should help in theory there a little bit, but his role is going to be inconsistent throughout the year. I'm a little bit worried about. So he's the one guy that I'd keep an eye on because that can mess with the young player's rhythm too. But he needs to play more physical on both ends of the floor, which we talked about in detail in this morning's video, so I won't go any further. But he needs to embrace the little things to earn a playoff spot in this rotation. He went for 20 and 9 this morning. That's great. I think he's a guy who could average 20 and 10 in the league for a long time. But on this team, they don't need that. They need him to be a version of Looney that has some vertical spacing and some perimeter spacing. That's what they need from him. They need defense. They need him to be a functional cog in the Golden State machine offensively. So if he embraces those little things, he will claw out a rotation spot because he's talented enough. But if he doesn't and he worries about his shot too much and he doesn't embrace the little things, he could be one of the guys that gets squeezed out of the rotation towards the end of the year. Then with Moody and Kuminga, it's offense-defense. I think Moody is already at a point where they trust him offensively, but I don't think he's good enough defensively. And I think Kuminga's already at a point where they trust him defensively, but they don't trust him offensively. I actually think Kuminga's got further to go on the offensive end than Moody does on the defensive end. So Moody is the guy that I'd look at as a guy that I think will get more and more minutes as the season progresses. Like I said, tough matchups early on in the year to test his defensive mettle. He's the guy that's going to be that they end up depending on in a playoff series in all likelihood. Not going to elaborate too much there because I talked about that a little bit this morning. But yeah, that's all I got on the Warriors for today. Of a lot of Warriors basketball this week. We will be back on Monday with another 7 games worth of preseason content. We're also going to do some gambling stuff over the next couple of weeks. So like over-unders and MVP, first team All-NBA, Coach of the Year, that kind of stuff. So lots of film breakdown, lots of NBA futures and stuff over the next couple of weeks. And then we're 2.5 weeks away from regular season basketball. So it's going to be a marathon, not a sprint, a lot of basketball, but I appreciate having you guys along for the ride. As always, I sincerely appreciate your support, and I will see you next time.